You are watching Distance Learning from Laughing Waters Studio. Today, we will paint a landscape with twin falls.
Good morning, welcome back. Today we're going to do another exercise with a waterfall and some water. It'll be a twin waterfall. This is the complete piece, which we'll work on over a couple of weeks. But for today, we're just going to work with the center vignette and create the rocks that'll frame the twin waterfalls, the rocks in the middle of the path and some side rocks, and work on ink accumulation and some dots and then some water strokes as well. So today we'll just work with this small piece, but I will enclose both this and the full model if you want to bite off a bit more. But this builds on our last 2 weeks of working with waterfalls and working with flowing water. So let's get started. So to help me keep my proportions, I've taken my paper, put it over the model, and just folded to make that size. You can certainly do it without that, but that gives me some constraints so I don't expand too much and keep my proportions. I'm going to start with my landscape brush. I'm also going to be using a detail brush as we get farther into the project. So again, I'm starting fresh, so I want to get my brush wet, use my mixing dish to shape the brush, wick off some of that water, and then pick up some ink. And I'm going to be starting with black ink to start creating the container for the waterfall and test it. And let's take a little more water out of that. Want it dark, but I also want it a little bit dry. So I'm going to start with this center shape and using more of the side of my brush and almost like a modified axe stroke. Just pressing at the start, bringing it down, beginning to define that boundary and container for the double falls. And I'll do this in a couple of layers. And again, I'm just pressing, pulling down so I get a shaded stroke using the side of the brush, coming down a little bit of a V shape here. Then I'll come over here and do the left or the right boundary of the second falls, or the right falls, coming down and building slowly my rock edge on that side. This I won't come quite as far. And this goes off the page or off that boundary. Then my other side, this is a little bit broader. Come down. And as I'm pressing, I get more ink. As I lift, I get more of a shaded area. So that sets our main rock. I'm going to go down into the lower left corner and pull some of these off the page. And I'll be coming back in a little while to then add some layers of wash and rubbing to further thicken this rock at the base. Next, I have these areas of rock. The first one is fairly high, and I just am barely putting in those shapes, just enough to create a definition, but I'll be adding more as I come back with more wash and prepare to add in my water. Here's a major piece coming down, a little bit of an angle. And then up here, there's a large obstruction, which will push the water to one side and the other. And another one right close underneath that. And I've done pretty much all of my black line work at this point. Now I'm going to shift and put a little bit of wash in, loosen up my ink, and even a little bit more. I want a medium to medium light gray, so something like that. And I'll also just dry the brush a bit because I don't want it too wet. Then I'll come back to where I started, and I'm going to add another layer at the top. Again, I'm working with the side of the brush and just kind of rubbing it on the paper, but I'm adding another layer of ink. This is a grayer ink, and so I'm taking out what had been the flying white or the rough white, and I'll come down a little farther, bringing this down into the mists. And so what happens if you start building this layer by layer, you're going to get a greater depth when this dries. So as opposed to just going straight to a full black, it's going to be ink accumulation and will in effect look darker than if you had just done one layer of black. And over to the left side, closing up some of this at the top. And so I can just slowly press, it fills it in. If it gets too dry, I can pick up a little bit more. But then as I'm coming down, I'm lifting, so I get a feathering, a fading of that line. Add the same to this rock on the side, which at the top is pretty solid, but again, just pressing as I come down, filling it in so that it is almost all solid. Then I'm going to go back to these little areas and add just a little more. I'm not doing too much pressing. It's almost like adding dots to get the shape of these obstructive rocks. Pulling it down, lifting though as I come down so I don't get too much water on the paper. I want even in the light, a fairly dry stroke. Coming over here, I can pull some of this off and some of it down, so I have now a lighter shade next to my darker. And then this large chunk, really pressing, getting that solid at the top, but leaving the bottom edge ragged. And then in this corner here, I have a couple of rock structures, do a couple of outlines here, bring some of this down, pick up a little more of my wash, doing shading lines, and then come back in. I can get that a little bit darker. A little bit darker at the top again, but fading as I go down. And pulling this farther down. And again, at least for this vignette, boldly going off the page. I'm going to come up to the top and add some more of this rock outline, some of the cliffs, a little distance, and again some shading lines for those pieces. A little bit more here. This is more like a bold rubbing, really adding some texture, a little bit of press and release to get some wetness and dryness all in the same stroke. Again, a little more wetness here to fill this in a bit. Then I'll do the distant shapes with a broader stroke. Need to get a little more ink in the brush or wash in the brush, starting up at the top and just bringing it down, almost touching that rock form in the center. But this is sort of a distant shore. I get a little more water in there so they fill. And coming up here, 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 a little more there, a little more here. And then I have this corner over here. I want to go just a little bit darker with that. Mix up a little heavier gray just to continue this piece over here. And it goes a little bit lighter. And a little more over here just to get some distance. So that's my general piece. Now I'm going to take my detail brush, get it wet, shape it, work it, and I'm going to start with the two main falls, and I'm going to dry the brush a bit. I want it to start fairly dry, so I'm going to start on the right side here. I have one main piece. Again, this I'm starting with the side of the brush, not with a point. A little bit of pressing at the top and lifting as I come down. So I can press a little bit more, get it to expand, and then lift as I come down. And I'm going to do this in sections. So I'm not doing everything at once. This is longer and lifting. And then I'll come back and add some more in a gray. Over here, pretty broad to begin with. I'm lifting as I'm coming down, and I want to be able to have my arm be mobile so that I can move with the stroke. One more, thin, thicker, thin. So now I'm going to loosen that up, make it a little bit gray, and come back again now, starting where I started, and just filling that in a little bit and pulling it down a little bit farther and going farther to extend it. Same here, starting a little bit thick and lifting, thick and lifting. And then I can add another supportive stroke on either side. Back over here doing a similar thing, bringing down that first stroke strong. It can even break into two, and then there's another thinner one coming down. Again, this is strong and lifts and thins out. This is strong almost all the way. So that's my beginning. I then will add sort of rivulets of water, and again, just getting the ink a little bit lighter. I don't want it too light, I don't want it to disappear, But what we'll be showing is the way water comes down and then goes from one side to the other side, creating a flow. So here we'll start just using that outline. This one coming along the rock. This one coming down that edge, coming below. And the challenge here is to get some sense of rhythm as well as some power. So as it gets closer to the bottom, I'm getting a little more cluster of strokes. Here, this is running along the side of this big rock and around, and this continues to come around. We come back up to the top of this side, it comes over that rock, around this rock, some of it in between, and some of it going to the other side. And you might, to give yourself some practice, try some of these on another sheet of paper before you do it on your study, which would make it a study for a study. Then down at the bottom, there's just a little bit of horizontal movement like we had last week with water pearls. And then on the big paper, this would continue, but I can do a couple of water pearls here. So then the last thing we have is to go back and find the dots. And for the dots, I'll switch back to my landscape brush. I'm going to start with the black dots, and I want it fairly dry. I'm going to start up at the top of the center piece. This is pretty dry now, and just add some dots on top, and I can be adding them into the black so it really ties them well onto that landform. So they're not just sitting on top, and some of them can come down quite some ways. And again, when this dries, this will add added depth and texture. So the same thing over here. Some of these are what we might call show-off dots. They're leaping off the edge. It really is an opportunity to show your ability to put a little bit of power into each and every stroke. I want to really, again, add more texture within the top of that, come down a bit. Same over here. And again, I'm really giving it a punch. You want every stroke to count. No stroke should be left behind. And some more over here. And up in this corner, I have a whole range of dots in this corner. And just for even the case of this vignette, that helps close this corner off, which makes this all the more powerful and open. Now I'm coming down to these bottom rocks. Again, just some dots to give it closure and texture. And then I'm going to add dots to the little rocks. And this, I'm going to use more of my point, but I just want to, it's like punctuating, putting little exclamation marks on each one of these. And what you're doing is closing the top so that it helps create a tension in open and close, but you're also adding a level of detail so that if I see this from across the room and I can admire the flow of the white and the movement, when I get up close, I can see your attention to putting a little bit of punch into every single little stroke. And then I'm going to go a little bit lighter here for these dots on the side piece, but they're serving the same purpose in providing some closure on the top. I can also go back into this piece, even though it's lighter, what I have in the brush, but adding to that to, again, thicken this, give it some texture and give it some depth in here as well. So these don't have to be big, but just enough to get some additional texture, additional thickness here. I can go up, pull it off the page. And then I want to go a little bit lighter, tip to water, very light dot. Dry off some of that so it doesn't get too much. And then I'm going to go to the top, and on this distant landform, I have some distant dots. A little more texture down here. A little more there. Just adding a couple of refinements, bringing down a little more of this shading and off the page. And there, I have completed the vignette. I had built my major forms, brought my water down, brought my rivulets down, and then the horizontal water to close it. So that is our exercise for this week. And I've enclosed both the vignette. I will also enclose the full landscape or attach it on the website. So if you want to take on the whole thing, we will. Or next week, I will complete this in its entirety. And that's it for now.